The sound of papers ripping echoed through my laboratory as my mother tore through a decade of my research, her face contorted with rage. "Your brother needs this estate more than you, Emma. He has a family to support," she screamed, throwing years of carefully documented genetic studies into the air. I stood there, watching my work flutter to the ground like wounded butterflies. 10 years of studying genetic markers, tracking hereditary patterns, and documenting our family's unique blood disorder, all being destroyed because my grandfather had left his estate to me instead of my perfect brother Michael. "Mom, stop," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Grandfather left the estate to me for a reason. He understood my research." She whirled around, her designer dress contrasting sharply with the sterile lab environment. "Research? Is that what you call hiding away in this lab while your brother builds a real life? He has 3 children. Emma." "3? What do you have?" "Papers and test tubes." I thought about the letter my grandfather had left me, safely locked away in my personal safe. The one that explained everything, the one I hadn't shown anyone yet. "This isn't about Michael's children," I replied. "This is about continuing grandfather's work." "His work?" Mom laughed bitterly. "Your grandfather was a businessman, Emma. The estate should go to someone who understands that. Michael has an MBA. What do you have? A PhD in playing with DNA?" The irony of her statement almost made me smile. Almost. My grandfather, Jonathan Pierce, hadn't just been a businessman. He'd been a brilliant geneticist who'd hidden his research for decades, building his business empire as a cover for something far more important. "The estate isn't just about the money, Mom," I tried to explain, but she was already pulling more files from my cabinets. $2 million. "Emma, the house, the laboratories, everything, it should be shared. Your father and I have decided. You're signing it over to Michael." I thought about the genetic markers I'd discovered, the patterns that had finally started making sense after a decade of work. The same work my grandfather had begun 40 years ago. "I won't sign anything," I said firmly. She stopped her destruction momentarily, her eyes narrowing. "Your father is on his way. Don't make this difficult, Emma. Family means sharing." "Family means understanding," I corrected her. "And you've never tried to understand what I do here." The lab door burst open as my father strode in, Michael trailing behind him with that familiar smug expression. "Emma," Dad's voice boomed through the space, "this ends now. Your brother needs this estate. You're being selfish." I looked at Michael, standing there in his expensive suit, successful real estate developer with his perfect family and perfect life. He had no idea what our grandfather had discovered, what I had confirmed through years of research. None of them did. "The lawyers will be here tomorrow," Dad continued. "You'll sign the papers or we'll contest the will. Your choice." I smiled then, actually smiled, which seemed to unnerve them all. "Actually, I called the lawyer myself. He'll be here in an hour. There's something you all need to see." "What are you talking about?" Michael spoke for the first time, his confidence wavering slightly. "Grandfather left me more than just the estate," I said, walking to my safe. "He left me the truth about our family, about why he chose me to continue his work." Mom started gathering the scattered papers, probably realizing too late that she'd destroyed important documents. "What truth?" Emma stopped being dramatic. I pulled out my grandfather's letter and a sealed envelope he'd left with his lawyer. The truth about why our family has a history of blood disorders. Why certain traits only show up in certain branches of the family tree. Why he spent 40 years studying genetics while pretending to be just a businessman. The color drained from my father's face. "Emma, whatever you think you know." "I know everything, Dad," I said quietly. "And in an hour, so will everyone else." Grandfather made sure of that. The hour that followed was tense. Mom tried alternating between threats and guilt trips, while Dad made phone calls in hushed, angry whispers. Michael just sat there, his smugness replaced by something that looked almost like fear. When James Morton, our family lawyer, arrived carrying a thick folder and a grave expression, I felt a strange sense of calm. Everything was about to change, but I was ready. I'd been ready since the day I found the first genetic marker that confirmed my grandfather's suspicions. "Shall we begin?" James asked, setting his briefcase on my desk, carefully avoiding the scattered papers my mother had thrown everywhere. I nodded, pulling out my own research files, the backup copies I kept in the safe, away from my mother's reach. "Yes," I said. I think it's time everyone knew what grandfather discovered. The lawyer began pulling out documents including DNA test results my grandfather had ordered years ago. As he laid them out one by one, I watched my family's faces change from confusion to disbelief to something close to horror. The truth about our family was about to come out, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. The tension in the laboratory was suffocating as James laid out the final document, a DNA test from 1985. My mother's hands were shaking, and my father looked like he might be sick. Michael just stared at the papers, his usual arrogance completely gone. As you can see, James began, his voice professional but gentle. Jonathan Pierce conducted extensive genetic research on your family line for over 4 decades. His findings were significant. This can't be right, my father interrupted, his voice hoarse. There must be some mistake. I pulled out my own research files, spreading them next to my grandfather's. I've confirmed everything, Dad. That's what my work has been about all these years. I wasn't just studying genetic disorders, I was following grandfather's trail, proving what he discovered. Which is what exactly? Michael demanded, but his voice cracked slightly. I think he already knew. Our family's blood disorder isn't just a random genetic mutation. I explained, pointing to the markers highlighted in both my grandfather's research and mine. It's evidence of a completely different genetic line. Dad isn't grandfather's biological son. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother grabbed the edge of my desk for support, while my father sank into a chair, his face ashen. Michael stood up so quickly his chair toppled over. You're lying, he snarled. This is just some trick to keep the estate. James cleared his throat. I'm afraid Emma is correct. Jonathan knew about this for years, but he chose to keep it quiet to protect his wife, your grandmother. However, he did leave explicit instructions about the estate. I watched as James pulled out my grandfather's letter, the original one he kept in his office. He wanted it to go to Emma specifically because she was the only one who understood the importance of this research, the only one who could continue his work. But I'm his grandson, Michael protested weakly. His only grandson. Biologically, you're not related to him at all, I said softly. Neither is Dad. Grandmother had an affair before Dad was born. Grandfather discovered this when he started researching our family's blood disorders, trying to understand why they didn't follow normal inheritance patterns. My father stood up suddenly, his face red with anger. You had no right to dig this up, no right to destroy our family like this. I didn't destroy anything, I replied calmly. I simply finished what grandfather started. He wanted the truth to come out, but he wanted it handled carefully, scientifically. That's why he left everything to me. Everything, my mother whispered. James nodded. The estate, the laboratories, and most importantly, all of Jonathan's research data. He was more than just a businessman. He was a brilliant geneticist who used his business success to fund his real work. Emma is his chosen successor. I walked over to my research station, pulling out a final file. There's more, I said. Grandfather's research wasn't just about our family. He discovered something crucial about genetic inheritance patterns that could revolutionize how we treat certain diseases. That's what I've been working on, taking his initial findings and developing them into something that could help people. My mother laughed hysterically. Help people? You've just destroyed your own family. No, Mom. I've revealed the truth. There's a difference. I turned to Michael, who was still staring at the DNA results. This doesn't change that we're siblings, that we grew up together. It just explains why grandfather chose me for this work. Because you're not really his granddaughter either, Michael spat. Actually, James interjected, Emma is Jonathan's only biological grandchild. Everyone turned to stare at me. I pulled out one final document, my own DNA test that grandfather had done secretly when I was born. Mom had an affair too, I said quietly, watching my mother's face crumble. With grandfather's youngest son from his first marriage, my biological father. That's why I inherited his genetic aptitude, his passion for research. That's why grandfather took such an interest in my education, why he encouraged my scientific pursuits. The truth hung heavy in the air. Decades of secrets exposed under the harsh laboratory lights. My father looked broken, my mother couldn't stop crying, and Michael just looked lost. The estate stays with Emma, James said firmly, and given the significance of this research, I suggest everyone take some time to process this information before making any rash decisions. I watched my family shuffle out of the laboratory, shoulders slumped, worlds shattered. Only Michael lingered, turning back to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Did you know?" he asked. "All this time, did you know?" I shook my head. "I discovered it just like grandfather did. Through the research. That's why he left me everything. Not to hurt anyone, but to make sure the truth came out the right way and his work could continue." Michael nodded slowly, then walked out, leaving me alone with James and the scattered remnants of my mother's earlier rampage. "Your grandfather would be proud," James said softly. "You handled this exactly as he hoped you would." I looked around my laboratory at the years of work, the secrets finally revealed, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The truth was out, but this was just the beginning. A month after the DNA revelation, I stood in my grandfather's study, now my study, surrounded by his books, his research notes, and the legacy he'd left me. The past few weeks had been a storm of emotions and adjustments, but somehow, everything had fallen into place exactly as he must have planned. My father hadn't spoken to me since that day in the lab, choosing instead to throw himself into his work, avoiding family gatherings and ignoring my attempts to reach out. Mom, surprisingly, had gone the opposite direction. She showed up at my lab 3 days after the revelation, her eyes red from crying. "I never told anyone," she'd whispered. "About James, your real father. I thought I'd taken that secret to my grave." "Grandfather knew," I'd replied gently. "He knew and he still loved you, still protected you. He just wanted the truth to come out after he was gone." She'd broken down then, telling me everything. How she'd fallen in love with James, grandfather's son from his first marriage, during a summer when he'd come to help with the family business. How they tried to resist, but couldn't. How she discovered she was pregnant just after James had died in a car accident. "Your grandfather figured it out when you were about 5, she explained. "You have the same way of looking at things that James did, the same passion for science. He started doing genetic research then, trying to understand more about inheritance patterns. That's when he discovered everything else too." Now, as I organized his papers, I found photos I'd never seen before. Ones of James, my biological father, working in this very laboratory. He had my eyes, my way of furrowing his brow when concentrating. In one photo, he and grandfather were bent over a microscope, both grinning with excitement over some discovery. Michael had taken the news better than I'd expected. He showed up at my lab a week after the revelation, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I've been thinking," he'd said, shifting from foot to foot. "Maybe we could work together somehow. I mean, I know nothing about genetics, but I understand business. If you're planning to develop this research into actual treatments." I'd smiled, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. Actually, I could use help with the business side of things. Grandfather left notes about wanting to establish a research foundation. Now Michael came by twice a week, helping me navigate the complex world of medical patents and research grants. He was still learning to accept that the estate wouldn't be his. But he found a new role, one that suited him better than he'd expected. The biggest surprise came from James Morton, who revealed that grandfather had left one final letter, to be opened a month after the initial revelation. I held it now, my hands trembling slightly as I broke the seal. "My dearest Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has happened as I hoped. The truth is out, and while it may have caused pain initially, I believe it was necessary. Our family was built on secrets that needed to be brought to light." I sank into his old leather chair, continuing to read. "Your father, my James, was the brightest mind I ever encountered. His death nearly destroyed me, until I realized he left behind something precious, you. Watching you grow, seeing his intelligence and determination shine through, gave me hope. You weren't just my granddaughter. You were the continuation of everything James and I had worked towards." Tears blurred my vision as I read on. "The research you've been continuing, it's more important than anyone realizes. James and I discovered something fundamental about genetic inheritance, something that could change how we treat dozens of diseases. But we needed more time, more data. That's why I built the business empire, to fund this research privately, away from corporate interests that might exploit it." The final paragraphs made my heart race. "In the hidden safe behind my desk, combination 23 to 1742. You'll find everything we discovered, including the preliminary trials we ran. With your recent breakthroughs, I believe you're ready to take this to the next level. The estate, the money, the business, it was all meant to support this work. You're not just my heir, Emma. You're the culmination of 3 generations of scientific pursuit. I went to the safe, easily finding it behind an old photograph. Inside were files I'd never seen before, research data that made my previous discoveries look like preliminary sketches. This was what Grandfather and James had been working on, the missing pieces I'd been searching for. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Meeting with the patent lawyers set for next week. You ready for this? I looked at the files, at my grandfather's letter, at the photo of James bent over his microscope with the same intense focus I saw in my own reflection. Yes, I typed back. It's time. The truth had shaken our family to its core. But from those tremors, something stronger was emerging. Not just a family bound by blood, but one connected by purpose, by understanding, and finally by truth. Grandfather had known this all along. Sometimes things had to break apart before they could be rebuilt into something better. I opened the first file and began to read, ready to continue the legacy that had been waiting for me all along.